Hi there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Recently one of our fans, Ross Burnett, sent us a question asking us to compare the Dothraki riders from Game of Thrones to the riders of Rohan from Lord of the Rings. These two groups of people have fielded some of the most prominent and powerful mounted armies in the fantasy genre, and they make a very interesting matchup. So thanks Ross for sending us that question. If you guys have a question like Ross's, please follow us on Facebook and send us a message. In the land of Essos, only the Dothraki are truly free. These were nomadic warriors who roamed the vast central plains in gigantic hordes in search of battle and pillage. Dothraki culture was relatively primitive, and everything in their society surrounded the horse. The word Dothraki in their language means rider, and when a Dothraki can no longer ride their horse, they're generally left behind. From infancy, Dothraki boys are trained to ride horses and learn how to fire bows from horseback. The Dothraki diet mainly consisted of horse meat and fermented horse milk. These nomads also feared the ocean because their horses did not drink its salt water. The Dothraki word for ocean literally is poisoned water. The Dothraki do not really have a concept of trade and wealth, but powerful individuals generally had many horses. And naturally, the Dothraki practiced a religion which worshipped an entity known as the Great Stallion. One could say that the Dothraki culture was perfectly designed to create great mounted warriors. The Dothraki were organized into clans known as khalasars. Each one of these groups were led by a khal. Large khalasars roamed the Dothraki seas looking for plunder and pillage. Because of the naturally violent tendencies of the Dothraki and the fact that their leadership could change as a result of an honor duel, the Dothraki rarely are united in large khalasars. There's also the significant logistical challenge of feeding a massive army in the middle of the Great Plains. The Dothraki do have one city located in the northeast of the plains known as Vas Dothrak. This was a sprawling tent city that could be found in the shadows of a giant mountain. In this city, the various Dothraki clans would gather and meet and exchange gifts. It was forbidden to draw a sword in the city or shed any blood. The penalty for such actions was death. Interestingly enough, you could still kill people, you just couldn't cut them with a blade and cause them to bleed. So I guess you could use a club or, strangle someone. It's a very interesting culture. So we've given you a little background on the Horse Lords of Essos. Now let's talk about the Horse Lords of Rohan, which is actually redundant because Rohan in their language means horse lord, so you're basically saying the Horse Lords of Horse Lords. Like the Dothraki, the Rohirrim were expert horsemen who also lived on a vast plain that could be described as a sea of grass. They were also excellent horse breeders, and their steeds were highly prized all over Middle-earth. The Rohirrim mostly lived in small villages on the plains where they farmed and worked the land. There were a few major cities and fortresses in the region as well. The riders of Rohan lived a good and simple life on their vast plains, and this was partly thanks to their neighbor to the east, the great kingdom of Gondor, which shielded Rohan from Mordor. The Horse Lords of Rohan have long had an alliance with the men of Gondor and repeatedly ridden to their aid and saved them from great peril, whether it was the Easterlings, Mordor, or the Haradrim. Whenever a great threat arose, the king would call the muster of Rohan, and every able-bodied man in the kingdom would mount their horses and ride until the king's campaign ended. The riders of Rohan seem to have a less warrior-like society than the Dothraki. It seems like their likeness and their society is mainly based off of the Anglo-Saxon culture. Tolkien had been a great admirer of Anglo-Saxon culture and was a distinguished professor in the field of Anglo-Saxon language. What's interesting is the fact that Anglo-Saxons were primarily known to fight on foot, utilizing shield wall formations. Usually mounted Anglo-Saxon soldiers would dismount right when they got to the battlefield and fight on foot. It's always been said, had the Anglo-Saxons actually been horse lords, it's possible that they would have withstood the invasion of the Normans and survived a bit longer. The Norman military system actually utilized full-time professional cavalry soldiers, whereas the Anglo-Saxons generally just equipped levied farmers with horses and had them ride to the battlefield. The riders of Rohan seem like a mixture of both of these cultures. They have a dragon, which is essentially close air support with napalm. During the Battle of Gold Road, a force of 10,000 Lannister soldiers were spread out on a road while on their journey back to King's Landing from Highgarden. Lannister armies are generally very well armored, well equipped, and well trained. The Lannister army and supply train were ambushed by over 100,000 Dothraki riders. Generally speaking, light cavalry, which is what the Dothraki are, do very poorly against heavily armored spear-equipped shield walls, which is what the Lannister army was. If you look at the Battle of Qohor, 20,000 Dothraki riders went up against around 3,000 unsullied professional spearmen and were completely destroyed. During the Battle of Gull Road, however, the Dothraki had a dragon with them, and it immediately broke through the Lannister shield wall, which allowed the Dothraki riders to quickly exploit that gap and overwhelm their enemies by surrounding them. The Dothraki entered the battle with almost no armor. They believed that speed and maneuverability were the most important factors when it came to warfare, and so they mainly carried araks, which were giant curved swords, along with bolas, daggers, and whips. The Dothraki were also trained to fire huge recurved bows, making them extremely dangerous at very long ranges. The Dothraki were true light cavalry. I mean, they were designed specifically to skirmish enemy forces, not necessarily go into frontal charges. However, because of their more aggressive warrior-like culture and spirit, it wasn't rare for the Dothraki horses to charge headfirst into armored enemy lines. Oftentimes, this would result in very obvious and expected conclusions. These aren't exactly the best tacticians in the world. The Dothraki should, in theory, excel against heavier cavalry. Their unarmored mounts and powerful bows should keep them well out of the range of more heavily armored units, while they could still pelt them with arrow fire. Of course, the Dothraki were also vulnerable to enemy ranged fire, and they also needed a lot of space to be able to operate effectively. In our own history, we've seen dominant military forces made heavily out of horse archers, like the Mongol hordes. But unlike the Dothraki, the Mongols had a more varied military force, which included lance-equipped cavalry and infantry units. The Dothraki looked down on infantry units or anyone who didn't ride a horse, which really severely limited their capabilities on the battlefield. The riders of Rohan were a much more balanced military force. Like the Dothraki, they mainly went into battle mounted. The average Rohan rider was armored relatively well. They usually rode into battle wearing a helm and chainmail and armed with spears, sword, and axe. The Rohirrim should not be considered heavy cavalry because they don't really wear plate armor, and they generally don't carry large lances either into battle. Some of these riders were also trained as archers. Hunting with bows was quite common in Rohan. But the bulk of their forces were mainly made up of medium cavalry units. The Rohirrim seemed to be far more effective at frontal charges than the Dothraki. During the Battle of Pelennor, King Theoden and his riders charged the rear of the armies of Mordor and wiped out a massive amount of orcs in a very impressive charge. They managed to break right through a heavy line of infantry armed with pikes and swords. The riders of Rohan also managed to pull off a similar feat during the Battle of Helm's Deep against Saruman's impressive Uruk-hai. The riders of Rohan are even unafraid of charging against the massive Mumakil of the Haradi. The riders of Rohan clearly have as much courage as the Dothraki, if not more. The Rohirrim could also dismount and fight on foot in shield wall formations like the Anglo-Saxon armies they were loosely based on. Okay, so if the Dothraki actually went up against the riders of Rohan, what would happen? I believe that the Dothraki will decide to carry out a frontal charge against the Rohirrim because, let's be honest, they're not led by the brightest minds, and their culture is steeped in superstition and a more primitive idea of what masculinity should be, like not wearing clothing in the middle of battle or any armor. The Dothraki would be able to engage the Rohirrim at a further range because of their recurved bows. The riders of Rohan would take early casualties, but their mail and shields should prevent some blows from being fatal. They would eventually be able to launch their own volley of arrows and will do considerable amount of damage to the Dothraki riders. Now, the best strategy here for the Dothraki would be to avoid any kind of melee or frontal charge. They should stay at range and pepper the Rohan riders with their own arrows, which of course have superior range. But let's be honest, the Dothraki love war, and most Khals would much rather engage in a full-on assault. The Dothraki weapons, as we mentioned before, are not really designed to break enemy lines. And plus, they never really carried spears or lances, so they didn't really have any shock weapons. Their curved swords, whips, and short knives are designed for skirmishing and chasing down routed infantry units from behind. The riders of Rohan would be a completely different type of enemy, one that the Dothraki were not used to fighting on Essos. While the riders of Rohan weren't true heavy shock cavalry, they were armored well enough to do a considerable amount of damage to the Dothraki and could easily destroy them in a frontal charge. I therefore give the riders of Rohan a pretty big advantage in this fight. For one, the Dothraki, as we mentioned, have very bad and stupid leadership. On the other hand, the riders of Rohan are considered medium cavalry. They're quick and mobile enough to engage horse archers with their own range-mounted units, but at the same time, they'll be able to hold their own in a melee. So there you have it, guys. That is our comparison between the Dothraki and the Rohirrim. Let me know in the comment section below who you think will win. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.